Earlier this month, Stellaris received both its first major DLC as well as a massive free update, and so it's only fitting that we take this time to examine the state of Stellaris. As is common with Paradox DLCs, Stellaris Utopia overhauls one aspect of the base game, massively improving it and revamping the old systems. In this case, the focus has been on internal politics and Megastructures, galactic wonders which had previously been available only to non-player fallen empires, as well as the addition of several new player-unique Megastructures. So let's kick things off with Empire Generation. Starting on the left, we have a new ethic. It's hive minds. This is really exciting because I've been wanting to play as a hive mind for some time, really. Ever since release I've been trying to make one with the current game systems, so yes, massive plus to have this introduced to the game. Unfortunately, these hive-minded entities are less than stellar in play. Now, this might simply be down to the fact that they don't benefit from a lot of the other additions that have been introduced to the game. For example, the internal politics systems don't work with them as they have no internal politics. And many of the traditions that can be added through the tree are now even less helpful. For example, the Harmony tree, which focuses on removing unrest and increasing the happiness of your populations, has no effect on a hive-minded society. And that's not the only tradition which is obviously less useful for the hive minds. They have immortal leaders, which means that aspects of discovery, supremacy, domination, where you get additional leader levels, aren't quite as helpful because your immortal governors and admirals are going to be maxed out anyway through their natural experience gain, and they're not going to need to be replaced quite so often. And on top of that, they also get the shaft when it comes to the Ascension Perks. They can only take the biological path. If you were thinking, I'd like to try out that synthetic path or the psionic evolution, you can't take those. You can only have the biological Ascension pathway, and the biological Ascension pathway is the most lackluster of them all. I'm not going to go into details here, we'll talk about that more when we reach the section of the video dedicated to those Ascension paths, but it is disappointing. Overall, it feels like the hive minds may have been a last-minute decision, and that's not helped by the fact that many of the pop-ups have not been changed in order to fit with the hive-minded society. For example, if you encounter your first alien race, you'll still get the media reports from the corporate news channel and the reactions of the individuals in your empire. But you don't have individuals in your empire, and why would you have news media? You're a hive mind. Once one member of your species knows something, you all know it. So it really does feel slapped on. Still, there is some value here, and maybe later on, when you're tired of dealing with political factions, then you would switch over to playing a hive mind just for that extra simplicity. Think of it as maybe some sort of easy mode. However, the rest of the changes to Empire Generation are more than welcome, as it really allows you to customize your particular empire to a degree that was not really there in previous iterations. We now choose our ethics and are then allowed to choose an authority type, be it democratic, oligarchic, authoritarian, or imperial. These then allow us to choose a set of civics from this list over on the side here, and we've got so many options to choose from. It's great. You could have an idealistic society for your democracy, you could have a police state, you can have a philosopher king or an exalted priesthood. It really helps make your society feel more like it's yours, like it's unique and different from anything else that exists in the galaxy. It really is great, and my only regret is that you can only pick 2 at creation. It would be nice if you could have more, because it would further allow customization of your empire, and quite often I feel like I don't quite reach what I'm looking for with just 2 civics. You can of course add more on later with technologies, but yeah, it would be nice to be able to pick more. These are all great changes, and there have been other smaller changes as well. For example, collectivism has been replaced by authoritarianism, and individualism has been replaced by egalitarianism. These are nice because they make these two ethics feel more cohesive, where before, say, the individualists felt like a mixture of egalitarianism and corporatism. It was an odd mix. This really makes them feel more fitting in this particular area. The only other noteworthy change in the Empire creation screen is going to be the fact that your flag now determines the color of your ships, which is nice to have. No longer do we have the limitation of the 6 ship types. We can now have a wider variety of ship designs, which really, again, helps to customize your Empire and how it feels, and that's surely a good thing. So now let's get into the meat of this update, the real gameplay changing stuff. It's factions, population happiness, and population ethics. These have been overhauled so that now you no longer have happiness being modified by a handful of buildings and decrees, and your populations no longer have multiple ethics. They only have one single ethic, which has various attraction factors throughout your empire. Members who have a certain ethic can join a population faction or political party, which will then have certain demands. When these demands are fulfilled, the population who belongs to these factions will have their happiness increased. And of course, happy pops have increased production, so it's always in your interests to keep them happy. This is pretty good, really, as it gives you something to do during the mid-game when you're perhaps not at war and building something up. You could be trying to satisfy your populations and dealing with internal factions in your empire. But overall, I can't say that I'm too happy with this system. You see, it's predictable and easy to ignore. Your militarists, for example, are always going to form the exact same faction every single game. Hell, in a multiplayer game, not only was my faction identical to my friends, they also had the exact same name. Your isolationists will always form an isolationist party. The pacifists will always find themselves forming a prosperity party. It's really not that great. And that's because you can game the system. Rather than having a mid-game challenge of juggling these political parties, I can simply design my empire with the ones which synergize best with one another and simply have them satisfied before they even form. Personally, I'd have liked to see things like the possibility of having multiple factions for any given ethic. Imagine if you're a xenophobic isolationist and you've got a large militant faction within your empire. They want to drive you to expand, and you need to satisfy them because they're the largest faction there. They're going to give you the most influence, the most happiness, which will in turn give you more productivity from those populations and an influence boost. So keeping them happy is very important. Then suddenly a more defensive-minded militant faction forms. They're worried that since the fleet is always outside of the Empire fighting, well, what about those aggressive empires on the southern border? Surely we should build up military stations and garrison our planets with defense forces. Their demands suddenly line up with those isolationists, and if I use a propaganda to shift some of those militants out of the supremacist faction, then I can have these two form a coalition which will change my playstyle potentially as I move forward through the game. And that sort of challenge would have been interesting and meant that every game would be unique and that I would be dealing with these political factions as I went on, juggling the needs and demands of many different groups in order to maximize the efficiency of my empire. This sadly is not the case. And then on top of that, you have the influence of the tradition system, which we can talk about now. So, the game has a new resource, Unity, and Unity represents, of course, the unity of your people as a whole. Unity is then spent on traditions, which give you nice bonuses to further customize your empire, and a lot of these bonuses are quite nice. Some of them, of course, were previously technologies that you could research, but having them laid out in a tree gives you the advantage of the fact that you can pick and choose and advance them as you want. It's a lot less random than it would be having these in the research tree. They're definitely a worthwhile addition to the game, but that's not without problems. You see, you don't have to choose between them. Every empire is going to end up with all of these traditions, and that's not good for customizing your empire. If there had been some sort of choice between the different systems, then I could be potentially giving up one advantage for a different advantage compared to my rivals. Sadly, that's not the case. It's just a matter of which order I want to get them in. And you may be thinking, well, given how Unity works in the game, that being that the more populations you have, the greater unity you need in order to adopt a new tradition, so faster growth equals slower unity and tradition growth, you're probably going to have several of these that your opponents don't have. And yeah, that's true, you are going to choose some and someone else is going to choose others, but with a non-unity focused empire, I managed to get all of the ones that were useful to my empire before the endgame crisis had occurred. In fact, I was well on my way of getting ones which were useless to me by the time that the Unbidden showed up, being only 2 potential points from having all of them. And yes, I did say that having the useful ones, because some of them are useless, not in and of themselves of course, but due to the fact that depending on your playstyle and how your empire is built, they're not going to be worthwhile. If you're constantly forcing planets to be ceded to you to expand your empire through military conquest, then supremacy is going to be pretty good for you. Diplomacy is not so much, as it's going to focus on building up your federation, which, if you're a conqueror, it's not so great. Domination is all about subjugating other planets so that they become your vassals, and if you're trying to conquer them, it's not as good, and obviously, again, the diplomacy traditions, not as useful. In one game I was playing as isolationists, and supremacy, diplomacy, and domination all grant me pretty much nothing of use. And then there's the ones which are too powerful. You've got the Harmony tradition, which I've already mentioned. This one gives you a 10% happiness bonus for adopting it. It gives you access to Paradise Domes, which generate 10% happiness, 5 food, and additional unity, meaning that they're really powerful and you're probably going to build them on your planets. It also gives you negative 20 unrest, so you don't have to deal with unrest quite so much. It gives you a fire rate bonus if you're defending your empire, and your leaders live longer. Overall, this is a really useful tradition to have, even if it's not particularly thematically fitting for your empire. But it does break the faction system. For example, I was playing a game in which my militant faction had dropped down to 30% happiness. This generated no unrest because overall they had 62% happiness, part due to Harmony, and giving them a straight 20% bonus from both the Paradise Dome and just the Harmony tradition itself. The negative 20 unrest, which of course cancels out some of the unrest that should have been generated by these populations, and various other advantages and happiness buildings like artistic monuments. And you're probably thinking, well, why is this a problem? It means that I was able to totally ignore my factions. This is a major part of this update, and this one tradition allowed me to completely circumvent it. I didn't have to deal with making my population happy. I could just play however I wanted. At least one of the factions was always going to be pleased by that, and the other ones got such a happiness boost that it didn't matter that I was upsetting them. Heck, I managed to suppress the militant faction to see what would happen. It dropped their happiness to 0%, and I still had no unrest to deal with. So, obviously I've got a wish list for the modders out there. That is, I would like more political factions so that even if I had maximum satisfaction, I could still play around with them, manipulating various parties and trying to encourage my, for example, again, militarists to join that defensive party so that I can synergize them with one of the others. I'd also like to have more traditions, or at least the ability to not be able to choose all of them. This would mean that I would have to weigh up my choices over which ones were of particular advantage to me, and it would also help make my empire feel more unique, knowing that I didn't just end up with all of them like absolutely everyone else did. So the next major point is of course Ascension Perks. You've got the ability to take an Ascension Perk once you complete a tradition tree. These are generally major modifiers to your empire, and a lot of them are pretty cool. We've obviously already mentioned that there's synthetic evolution, psionics, and biological ascension. There's the pre-mentioned Megastructures, which are obviously awesome, and there's a bunch of others which give you nice little bonuses. Plus 10% research, for example, extra damage against endgame crises if you're struggling with those, and the extra damage against fallen empires, the ability to terraform faster, or the ability to clear any tile blockers without needing to do the research. All of these are very nice, although again I wish there were more of them. Really, I don't have any problems with these. They're wonderful, they're a nice addition to the game. The only thing that I really could complain about is the biological ascension path. It's incredibly underwhelming, especially when you consider the other two options. And well, you're probably thinking, why would you ever choose it then? Simply choose the better or more interesting option. The problem is, of course, hive minds. As I mentioned earlier in this video, hive minds can only ever take biological ascension, and all it does is add more traits. Some of these traits are better than the ones that you've probably already got, and you can have up to 7 of them, so that's cool. But really, it's not as cool as the other ones. Synthetic evolution turns your race into cyborgs and then fully replaces them with AI machines. It's really cool, and the modifications that you get to your populations and leaders is also really nice. There's also the interaction that you have with the AI rebellion in-game crisis, which is altered, at least I'm told. I've never been able to spawn the AI in this case. But the interaction with that endgame crisis has changed. Similarly, the psionic ascension path leads to the Shroud, which is sort of Stellaris' version of the Warp. And it's really cool. It also allows you to speak to the Scourge. The Praetorians come up and you can now translate them using your psionic powers, allowing you to talk to them. It doesn't really change the event too much, or at least it hasn't in any of the games where I've played, but it's still a nice feature, and that's not the only thing, of course, that you can do with that. The Warp adds plenty of different options that you can play with, and while a lot of them seem to be resulting in dice rolls, it's still cool to see and far superior to the biological path. And of course we've saved until last the very best of the features in the newest expansion, and that is Megastructures. These things are galactic wonders. Dyson spheres, ring worlds, science nexus. These things are just really cool, and everyone's been itching to get their hands on them ever since you first encountered a ring world inhabited by a fallen empire. Grabbing these, however, is not necessarily easy. There's a number of different ones. Habitats is probably the easiest to get. It's a 12-slot artificial planet in the form of a gigantic space station. You gain access to this with the battleships. and deep space installations technologies, which you can have within 50 years, and that is admittedly dependent on luck, but somewhere between year 50 and 100 you'll probably end up with the ability to make habitats. It will cost you an Ascension perk, but it's totally worth it, as these things allow you to really expand on and build a taller empire. And speaking of tall empires, yes, this totally enables you to build a tall empire. It doesn't, however, quite edge out having a wide empire, as you still need a lot of resources to build these stations. If you have a, say, 3-planet empire, then you're going to be skimping and scraping in order to raise enough minerals to build the station in the first place. Compared to, say, a gigantic quadrant spanning empire, this thing could build 3 of them at the same time. I know, because that's what I do. I have my large empire build 3 habitat stations all at the same time, and it's great. It vastly expands my capability to build more depending on whether I need energy or minerals. I can simply dedicate the station to that. The real problem I have, however, is in the form of the other megastructures. These require a technology called mega engineering, and every time that I've had it, it's been after I've finished the game, either through a domination victory or the Unbidden wiping me out. In most games where I have got the mega engineering technology, it's popped after I've defeated the Unbidden fleet. I'm the dominant force in the galaxy, and I'm just really needing to mop up, so really they don't have too much gameplay effect, and this engineering rare technology really needs to be pushed forward so that you can get it earlier. And then there's the maths. It just doesn't add up. Let's take an example of the Dyson sphere. It generates 400 energy when it's complete. However, a habitat can generate 100 easily. Now, why is this a problem? The habitats are cheaper than the Dyson sphere. It's also possible to build multiple habitats at the same time. With a Dyson sphere or other megastructure, you can only be building one in the galaxy at a time, and once you've built them, the initial stage doesn't actually generate any resources. In fact, you generally have to go through a 4-stage process where each one generates slightly more resources. By the time that I had my Dyson sphere up and running, I could have built easily 4 habitats, decked them out with the necessary power plants, and had them generating more energy than the Dyson sphere would. It really just doesn't add up. The Science Nexus as well has a similar problem. A habitat dedicated to science generates 33 resource in each science resource in each category. The Science Nexus only generates 50. Again, you can only build one megastructure at a time, except for habitats. You can build multiple of those. The habitats take far less time and cost less resources, so ultimately if you want to build a giant science nexus, find a system which has a lot of planets in it and just build habitat stations around them. It's much easier and more effective, and you'll be able to get them earlier. The Sentry Array, on the other hand, is useful. It has no parallel. It's a giant system of radar and monitoring stations which allow you to see the entire galaxy. Any enemy fleet movements, or allied fleet movements for that matter, you can see. You can check what the fleet's composition is. You can look at which components each battleship has and therefore devise a counter before you go to war. That's really useful. However, again, it comes way too late. Each of the games where I've managed to build a Sentry Array, I've already pretty much won. I don't need to know that my opponent's 50k fleet has Tachyon Lancers, because my fleet is 300k and doesn't take any casualties when it engages his. It's a shame, because this is probably the most useful and interesting of the Megastructures, and it really could have been helpful if it had appeared earlier in the game. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And of course, the last Megastructure is the Ring World. Unfortunately, this one has another provision on it. It requires a completely separate Ascension perk, meaning that if you want to have all of the Megastructures, you're going to need to set aside 3 Ascension perks just to have that. If you want to also have one of the pathways of Ascension, synthetic, psionic, or biological, you're also going to need to set aside some Ascension pathways, which does put something of a limit on these things and the usefulness of the other pathways. The Ring Worlds are interesting. They produce a large Gaia planet, basically, and 4 of them. But again, they're really slow to build, and they're also coming in really late game. Once more, I'm not able to build these things generally until after the game has finished, the in-game crisis is defeated, and you're mobbing up. You really don't need them. It's more of a vanity item. That being said, I probably sound a bit too harsh on these. I actually think they're really cool, and I do go out of my way to build them, even though I'm not getting any real gameplay value out of them. It's just nice to have them. I like to think that my race is technologically advanced enough to build these galactic wonders, and that they'll remain long after my people have fallen into debauchery and collapsed in on themselves. I really probably roleplay more than play optimally, so it doesn't matter so much, but if you're really concerned about the gameplay value of these Megastructures, it's just not really there, except for the habitats. Again, those things are really, really good. So, all in all, I feel like Utopia in the 1.5 update is something of a mixed bag. It does feel like I kinda have to go out of my way in order to enjoy it as much as I would, since it doesn't quite mesh up with my particular tastes and gameplay. That being said, I'd still recommend getting it. The Megastructures are just cool and fun to have. The habitat stations in particular are super useful. The politicking, while you can totally ignore it if you want to, does add more flavour to the mid-game, which has always been somewhat dull, so having that option to play with those systems is totally welcome. I would, however, really like to see these things expanded. Multiple parties, so that I'm not always able to predict what my factions are going to be when I start a game. The ability to have those factions shift around, forcing me to change my gameplay style as I progress through a game in different eras of my empire, would be also very cool. I'd also like to see multiple new traditions and be forced to choose between them, so that I feel like I'm weighing up different options rather than going, yeah, I'll just get that one later. The Ascension perks are also really cool. There's only one which I would think is particularly underwhelming, and that's only because the other 2 options are just way better. That biological path is fine, it's just, it's not as good as the others, and you're probably never going to choose it for that reason. So yeah, it really kind of feels more like a base which could be built upon rather than a totally finished product, and that's really what you've got to hope for, either from Paradox or modders. But that's all for me. Unfortunately, I can't really squeeze any more into this video without making it too long, so if you've got any questions, or if I've stammered over some point in an awful way and you'd like to correct me, then leave a comment and I'll be sure to get back to you.